So welcome everyone out in space and here at the Bureau. My name is Greg Newton. My partner is Don Jokum. We are the co-founders of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, which is where you now find yourself. And the Bureau, we like to say, is a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And this is the service that we provide, is holding this little space for queer culture of all kinds. So thanks for coming out today, whether here or there. And what else do I want to say? Oh, if you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that on our website or at the back of the room. And you'll get an email every other Monday about our upcoming events. And we have quite a few events lined up for the near future and surely thereafter. So we're going to jump right in. I'm going to introduce our two readers, and they're going to read and engage in some conversation, and we'll go from there. So Chelsea Abdullah is an American Kuwaiti writer born and raised in Kuwait, where she grew up listening to stories about mysterious desert creatures and wily, only sometimes likable heroes. Consumed by Wanderlust, she has put down roots in various states. After earning her MA in English at Duquesne University, she moved to New York, where she currently lives. When not immersed in her own fictional worlds, she spends her free time playing video games, doodling characters, and hoarding books she doesn't have the shelf space for. Sounds familiar. And Naseem Jamnia is a Persian-Chicagoan, former scientist and fiction MFA graduate from University of Nevada, Reno. Their work has appeared in the Washington Post, Pitch Media, Cosmopolitan, The Rumpus, The Writer's Chronicle, and other venues. A Lambda Literary Otherwise and the inaugural Samuel R. Delaney Fellow, Naseem is the managing editor at Sword and Kettle Press and the author of The Bruising of Qilwa. So please give them a warm welcome and let's get started.
All right, well, thank you everyone for being here. I'm so excited to be here with Naseem talking about their fantastic book, in which they look so good together. Very cozy. Yeah, but also like a really good amount of contrast as well. And you know, the size is amazing. Yeah, so do you want to do a very brief reading of this very tiny section? Would you like to start? Or?
Sure. I will just read the first page and a half or so, since I want to keep it short. And does it stand alone? Not really, but good enough. In the early sun-swept hours of the morning, when purples and pinks smeared across the sky like blood, Firuza Jafari looked for a job. It had taken a mere 15 minutes to walk from the underdock to their destination. Down unlit streets they stepped, keeping watch for broken glass and wooden splinters, stepping around plumped rodents' carcasses, tails run over by carts or feet. The sailors and fisherfolk, up before dawn, filled the air with laughter and chatter and other sounds of their trades, interrupted but not discontinued by the Moisen's call to prayer. The briny smell of the sea and mingled odors of rotted fish and garbage faded as Firuz walked. As the crossing into the next district, the residential buffer between the largest market and the docks, transitioned from broken stones to smooth wooden planks, Firuz's pace slowed until they found what they sought. Over the doorway, a painted wooden sign read Kofi's Clinic in cracked and faded leathers. Underneath, in a smaller but darker script, someone had translated it into Dilmuni, as if the free democratic city-state of Qilwa was still part of the queendom. Firuz's stomach backflipped, rebelled despite their lack of breakfast. Already the humid air was warm, droplets dribbled down the back of their neck. The clinic wouldn't officially open for another few hours, but if the rumors were true, Healer Kofi would already be here, readying for the day's steady stream of those who needed him. Firuz needed him, all right, though not quite in the capacity of a healer. The door's open, rumbled a deep voice from within. Come in. The voice carried over on a slight breeze, brushing past Firuza's ears like gentle lips. It brought smells of mint and ginger, which should have soothed them. Healer smells, familiar smells. They reached to tug at a length of hair that no longer existed. They'd cut their hair the day before, in preparation for this meeting, back to its usual top crop. Before pushing through, ready to persuade this Kofi person to take them on, no matter the objections.
Just the amount of world building and scene setting in that page and a half is phenomenal. I guess now for something a little different. I'm going to read the very beginning of this story, a sort of prologue called The Tale of the Jinn. Neither here nor there, but long ago, our worlds belonged to the Jinn, those doomed creatures who roam our desert like lost spirits. Unlike us humans, who were created from the earth, the gods crafted the Jinn from an ancient flame that allowed them to live for hundreds of years and gave them the power to use magic. This is why some Jinn can change shape, and others can breathe fire or travel the world in the blink of an eye. For a time, the Jinn did as the gods commanded. They loved and nurtured the world they were given, and there was peace. But while most Jinn were grateful to the gods, there were 7 Jinn kings who were dissatisfied with their meager magic, and they expressed their discontent by destroying the land. They created winds so wild they blew the water from lakes and oceans, and flames so hot they burned away fields of grass, leaving behind nothing but sand. When the gods saw the havoc the kings had wreaked, they decided to punish them. They gave them what they desired most. They made their magic more powerful, but at the cost of it being uncontrollable. The magic was so strong it burned holes in the sand, sinking the Jinn cities and causing the Jinn to vanish from this world. In the wake of their disappearance, the gods created us humans. Magicless and mortal we may be, but we are the gods' faithful servants. There are some who believe we must use our faith to restore life to this barren world. They say the only reason we have any nature left is because there are hunters who capture escaped Jinn and sacrifice them to the gods. They claim that a Jinn's silver blood is filled with life, that it can turn sand to water and make trees and flowers bloom. But our faith need not be so twisted. Remember, Layla, not all Jinn are evil. Luli had buried many things since her mother last told her that story. Her name, her past, her parents, but the story she had never forgotten. So 2 very different kinds of openings, I think. But since we just read our openings, I think it'd be really cool to talk about what sort of inspirations came into writing both of these stories. Since we're talking about storytelling traditions and the things that I guess we were raised with that sort of made it into the story. Where did the concept begin for you? When did you what inspired it?
Yeah, so I know we were going to talk about video games later, but let's talk about video games now. So the summer after my first year in my MFA program, my best friend sat me down and was like, so I've been telling you to play Dragon Age for a while. Now it's time for you to play Dragon Age. And I was like, okay. So I played, I was totally hooked, and I had played the second game when I decided I wanted to use it as kind of a springboard. So the second game takes place in a city-state off of the coast, I guess, of like the main country in the first game, Ferelden. And at the end of the first, well, it doesn't happen contemporaneously. For a little bit, it happened contemporaneously, but there's a magical plague going on during the first game. Shocker, there's a magical plague in here too. And there's refugees fleeing to the island of Kirkwall. And the second game takes place over 10 years. You play it, I think it's like year 1, year 3, and year 10 that you play. So you see the way that the landscape changes. And one of the constants that happens like throughout the whole thing is that there's a healer who can come onto your party. He he's in the slum district, and he's taking care of the refugees because no one else will take care of them. And I love this character. He's super interesting and really complex, and I would die for him. And I was like, well, I was trying to learn how to write a short story. Shocker, this is a novella, it's not a short story. And I was like, well, here's a scenario in which there is this healer who's taking care of refugees that is like undesirable refugees. I mean, we could argue kind of like what refugees are desirable based on colonialism and all that, but and I found that really compelling. And I was like, well, I have a story in which there is a country that's having a genocide happen, which means that there's going to be refugees. And oh, by the way, there happens to be an island city-state not too far off the coast. What does this island city-state look like during this genocide refugee crisis? So that's where the story started for me. Like I said, it was meant to be a short story. 12,000 words later, I was like, this is not a short story. I did write a short story version of it eventually, but
Well, the world building that you have in this, though, like, I'm surprised you could even do a short story version.
no, I mean, it's like a very, even that short story version is like 9,000 words. So it's really pushing it. But yeah, no, I thought because I know the world so well, it would be easier. In fact, it made it harder to keep it shorter, but that's really where it began, like playing Dragon Age 2 and being like, I want to try to learn to write a shorter story.
You did a novella, though, which is like not quite a novel, so.
Yeah.
It's a short novel.
I was talking to a friend and she was like, well, how would you describe a novella? And I was like, I think the best novellas are probably long, short stories, but this is a little novel. Like this is a little novel. It's not a long, short story. But the novellas that I think really do the form justice are like a longer short story. They keep everything pretty tight. I would argue this is not as tight as it could be, but
I mean, I'm not a big novella reader, but based on what I read, I think you did the format justice. So with your smaller novel, no, and one thing that I think I'm amazed by, one of the many things I'm amazed by in reading this book, is just the amount of world building, and you can see it even in the first half, page and a half. You put so much thought into, the city and its people, and there's a sort of micro level to it, but it also it kind of zooms out as well. Like you go through all of these different layers, and even though you're following Firuz, who was the main character, you also get these compelling stories of these other characters and the way, the political situation has impacted them as well. So the fact that you're able to do this in less than 200 pages, as someone who wrote like a 460-page book, I cannot imagine.
I love your 460-page books. So it gives, like novels give more room to breathe, right? Like you're able to kind of slow down and have these quiet moments of like people having meals together, right? Which is, I think, very, very big in our, granted, what culture doesn't love meals? Every culture, like, we're a food-based culture, it's like every culture is a food-based culture, right? But like, in West Asia, mealtime is, I don't want to call it sacred, because again, everyone loves food, but like so much happens around, for us, the sofra, I don't know if you guys also eat on the floor, but it's a lot. So.
Yeah, no, it's a very, it is an incredibly social time, it's kind of when everyone gets together and, tells their stories. I'm obsessed with storytelling. You can tell if you read my book. But yeah, no, it's a very social time. And thinking about my grandmother who, every time I would clear my plate, be like, that's it? That's all you're eating? Okay,
eat more.
You gotta eat more food. So food is definitely important. May or may not be one of the reasons I wrote this book, to explore all of the different, to explore that part of my culture, but then also other components as well. No, and thinking about the inspiration for mine, food was obviously food was obviously important to me. The characters are eating and sharing a lot of meals in this book, and also it usually is a time for all of them to regroup and kind of like figure out what's going to happen next on their kind of grand chaotic adventure.
Which you need those quiet moments, right, where you're like, okay, we're gonna eat this different delicious falafel and hummus, right?
Yes.
And then also, where are we gonna go next? Are we gonna walk into the desert and potentially die? So
which is always the question, I feel like, in this book, like when are we gonna be safe? The answer is never. But when you're eating food, the illusion is there. But I feel like for me, I love you talking about video game inspirations because I feel like that also plays into my novel as well. Like you can kind of see that, I think, in some of the items and objects that are in the story. Like there's a bag of infinite space that one of the characters carries around. She's a merchant and she sells magical wares, and so it just felt natural that she would have a bag that has infinite space. But that idea in particular came from it was just this observation I had with video games, where I noticed your inventory was there was no end to the inventory in video games. I'm like, where are the characters keeping all of these items? They're like 99 potions.
It's very frustrating when there are like limits. You're just like, God damn it. Like I'm out of room. Resident Evil does it where you run out of room. I'm playing The Witcher right now and I'm like, oh, you have a weight inventory.
And you're like, it's realistic. It's realistic to have a weight inventory. Right. But like in a video game, you're like, but I want to carry around my 99 potions.
Exactly.
And also like these random boots that I picked up off the ground and all these random things I will never use. So I remember thinking about a lot of that when I was incorporating it into the story. Although like I guess the starting point for me was, the inspiration were those stories that I had grown up with, around food, but also just in general, my dad used to tell me and my sister a lot of stories at night. And that was one time that I especially looked forward to. And he would sit down and tell us versions of the Thousand and One Nights tales. Yeah. And I remember those tales and they kind of, I don't know if you've had this experience, but as a kid, I kind of, I took those tales for granted. Yeah. And then when I got older and I moved to college, I moved to Colorado for university. I suddenly had like this yearning for all these stories and, I think this appreciation for them as well, because, distance makes the heart grow fonder. And when you're separated from, part of your roots or part of your culture, I think you feel that more strongly. And so I had this feeling of, I really miss these stories and I really miss this culture. And I, hadn't seen a lot of that on the bookshelf. There were a couple books here and there. I know The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty, I believe was out. I think I read that one as I was beginning to draft this book, which was a happy surprise for me.
I think it came out fall of 2017, if I remember correctly. So it was already, when it had come out.
And I know that it did come out a while ago. And I remember, but the first time I saw it, the first time I read it, I was like, I've never read anything like this before. And it felt so, not validating isn't the word that I'm looking for, but I felt seen in a way because I hadn't really seen those stories in SFF before. And granted, it wasn't those particular stories that inspired me to write the Stardust Thief, because I kind of had this idea of writing a love letter to oral storytelling and writing a love letter to all these stories, which is why there are stories within stories in Stardust. So it started there, but then, as it kind of snowballed from there, of course, I drew inspiration and was inspired by all these other authors who would come up with books. I think Saladin Ahmed also has, Throne of the Crescent Moon. That one is another one that comes to mind. But there weren't a lot. There weren't a lot of those stories. Yeah. And so anytime I see this kind of, representation on the market, especially written by authors who are from that culture, who have experienced that culture in this personal way, I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, I like what you said about being seen, because that's exactly it. I picked up City of Brass and I suddenly we have the devas, and that's like the old Persian word for jinn, right? So when they're just like, I'm not jinn, I'm deva. I'm like, oh my God, wait a minute. this is very familiar. And the deva tribe in it, they were like, we're not like, oh, jinn. I'm like, this is exactly what Iranians are like. We're just like, we're not Arabs. Like, please, for God's sake, stop trying to conflate our cultures. There are a lot of overlaps, right? And that's what Islam did. And we also are in the same area, and we were constantly in communication with each other. Obviously, there's overlaps. But just like that kind of just like Dara's attitude, I was like, oh man, this is very familiar to me. But it was so gratifying to finally see that in a fantasy space. I talk about this a lot, especially on my book tour. It's a very official book tour. There are quite a few YA Iranian authors who are coming to the stage, and they're writing mostly contemporary YA, which I think is vital. I think that's important. But I grew up reading fantasy, and so I want to see fantasy that reflects my culture and my people in this such a rich storytelling tradition. And so, because I want that, that's why I created it, right? So just being able to see people who also are we also want to be talking about these our cultures that we grew up with in fantasy spaces, particularly, or speculative fiction spaces in particular. It's really meaningful.
Right. I'm thinking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think this was in your acknowledgements or in an author's note, you were talking about how that influence kind of naturally wove itself into the story, your sort of your background and your culture. Because you started with this concept of a healer in the city, But then that kind of made its way into the story. So how did that happen? I mean, even if it was a natural process, when did you see that start to happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so in my author's note, I talk about, some people have said that it really put the book in context, so maybe read it first. I say don't read it first because there's a major spoiler in it. Yeah, major spoiler in it, don't read it first. But I talk about how, being from Iran, and I don't know if you, I doubt as a Kuwaiti you have the same feeling because you guys didn't have an empire.
Yeah.
But Iran, like I was always raised with the Persian Empire was great, right? Like we were the largest empire the world had ever seen when we were at our heights. We were a benevolent empire. We were a kind empire because we allowed people to keep their cultures and their religion. They just had to give us tribute, right? My dad usually left off the tribute part, right? And to some extent that is true, right? Like we have, for example, like the names of the workers who worked on Persepolis. Like Darius had written it in stone. It was buried underneath Persepolis. Like archaeologists unearthed this. It must have been an archaeologist's dream, like just finding this. But on the other hand, it's still an empire, right? Like an empire is an empire. If you go into someone else's land, you're like, this is our land now. Give us your resources. Give us tribute. Like that is sterile imperialism. And so I started kind of thinking about that when I started taking post-colonial classes in grad school. In my second grad school, because of course I did the thing where I changed careers. When I was in my MFA, I took it's for life. Yeah, to become an artist, that's so I was in a post-colonial class and we're talking about kind of British colonialism and post-World War II colonial movements, and I was like, so I started thinking about the Muslim conquest of West Asia, because I was like, we don't talk about that in terms of colonialism. But then I started thinking more and more back, and I was like, empires are part of human history, right? Like there's always kind of this impulse to get more than what you have, to expand out, especially if you consider yourself great in some way. I'm like, but like, would Rome have happened if Persia hadn't happened, right? I mean, like there was, granted, these are very different models of empire in some ways, but like, I felt like I couldn't divorce what eventually becomes like European colonialism, which again, like looks very different, but has like, just tie its roots back to this ancient empire. And we weren't the first empire, obviously we're not the last, but I started having this kind of ethical quandary of like, my whole life I've been told to be proud of this thing. And I don't know that I can be proud of this thing in the same way anymore. But then the thing that complicates it even more, and that's kind of a big chunk of this book, is that like, if you mention that you're from Iran nowadays, like on the streets, people are like, oh, terrorists, right? Like that's kind of an automatic kind of jumping point. When January 6th happened, Susan Collins from Maine was like, oh, I thought it was the Iranians storming the White House. Just like, it's like kind of hilarious, but like she literally she wrote about that and she said, I thought the Iranians had finally attacked. And
that's like default for some
right,
people,
exactly. So like, and like when Bush was talking about the axis of evil, like he included Iran in it, right? Like and it's certainly, I think, stems farther back than the hostage crisis. The hostage crisis didn't help. The CIA did a coup in the 50s, right? So suddenly I'm like, well, we're in this space where like once upon a time, or neither here nor there, but long ago, or there was not, we were an empire. But now, we're a marginalized group in the United States, especially. We're such a minority that we're not counted as a minority. Usually I check Asian on the box, so like I think a lot of people from West Asia were like, we're also Asian things.
Yeah, I don't think I even see like.
No, sometimes you do, but rarely. I would check out the error too, but like, so like, what does it mean to kind of occupy the space where now you're marginalized? And even though it was thousands of years ago at this point, how do you reconcile this ancient history of imperialism that very much influences the way that imperialism later would grow? And so, as I was writing this, I was exploring a lot more of the world building. Like I mentioned, like I had this larger world already in place. I was already playing around with a different story. But I was like, the story that I was playing around with takes place 40 years after this. When it takes place 40 years after the genocide. But I was like, well, what happens when you're in that genocide, right? When you're in that moment and you're directly confronted with your imperial history because of the political situation that you're in. And I was just like, I couldn't not write that story as well, because it felt like it was sloppy storytelling, you know, like bad world building, but also it's like this, that's what I suddenly became really interested in, because my classwork was having me like confront these kinds of issues. I don't know if my teacher had any intention of that thing, but like, you know, I can really appreciate that, like I was given that space to kind of really think those things through.
Yeah.
And I still don't have an answer, you know, like I still kind of walk around and I wonder, and I think about like my late grandfather, who's so proud of being Persian. You know, we have a rich cultural history, rich arts and literature. You know, like we really have like, if you talk to like any Iranian, they're like, oh, great, like, you know, like, and then like let's put the race question aside, because plenty of Iranian, you know, my dad is like, well, you know, we're the true Aryans. My father, your name is Muhammad Ali. No one thinks you're white. Nobody thinks you're white, please. But I really just could not let it go. And so now that's like become a major thing with this world. It's just like constantly kind of thinking through that question.
And how, I mean, given the fact that these are such big ideas that you're right, they don't have easy answers, and they're complicated, and history is complicated. How did you funnel that into Fairuz's story? Like, why did you decide that Fairuz was going to be the first character that, you know, that introduced us to the world, but also like why their story first?
That's a good question. Let's see if I have an answer for that. A couple of reasons. One is that I really like quiet stories. I like live and die by the slice of life. Like I love slice of life stories. I think they're so much fun. I really like the quiet moments that we get between the adventures. You know, I think we all need moments to breathe. And so many books are about kings and queens and like great people doing great things, but most of us are not that, right? Like most of us are just everyday folks trying to live our lives. And so, you know, I was really curious about like, what does the everyday folk look like during like a great, massive kind of historical event that's happening, right? Like this political upheaval, which we are living through, right? We have been living through that. And, you know, coincidentally, it is a plague book. I started writing it before COVID, but, you know, the way that I think we all were navigating this like international trauma that we're going through. It made me really just think about kind of like the everyday person. Firuz being a healer, I think also was like one, you know, this is kind of a love letter to my science roots back in the day when I was a pre-med and then a researcher. So, you know, that was kind of one thing I wanted to be able to draw upon my science background. But also, you know, like my brother and sister-in-law are both doctors. I saw the kind of burnout that they were experiencing. You hear, you know, a lot of, just kind of even before the pandemic, a lot of healthcare professionals experience burnout. So I was like, oh, what does it look like when you're a healthcare professional in the plague? I guess I'll write about it. But I was really compelled by the everyday person because that's what we all are, right? We're not, all of us are not the president or the, you know, cabinet member, or, you know, Queen Elizabeth or, you know, whatever. Like that's not what spaces we're occupying. And as a result, we have a very different experience and relationship to these kinds of big events, right? Like if you're the everyday person who's not in charge of policy, right? You're seeing kind of like what the policy is being put in place, like what the political movers and shakers are doing. And all you can do is like have an emotional reaction, right? Like, yes, you can vote, you know, or at least in the United States, right? Like, yes, you can vote, but it's not like we're voting every week, right? We're not able to, even if you're calling up your representatives every single day, like who knows if that's actually going to translate into you know, actual policy change. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't.
Right.
And so I was really compelled by that idea of taking kind of this individual also who had like limited information, you know, like it's really interesting trying to do world building for a world that only you have the context of when the person that you're doing world building for won't also have that context, you know, like I think about walking on the street and just like picking a random person and being like, hey, do you know the history of like how, for example, how Nixon and Reagan basically caused like the war on drugs in order to marginalize Black people further, right? Most people will not know that history, right? So there's just like, there's all of these things that most people just don't know the roots of. And so like having to, and in the same way, like the characters don't know the roots of these conflicts, right? They don't know how to trace back, like, well, this makes sense for X, Y, and Z reason, which is why Firuz and their mentor Kofi have conversations, where Kofi's like, well, when you're afraid that you're going to lose your recently won independence, right? This is how you react. And Firuz is like, I never thought about it like that, So, yeah, did I answer the question?
Yes. All that and more. No, and I mean, I think the approach of like making something, we all have our own biases and we all have our own perspectives because that we're human.
Right, absolutely.
We only have our own perspective. And like, we can broaden our perspective, we can educate ourselves, which are things that we should always do.
Right.
But I think that's a very human perspective to take a for all of this, for this, for these concepts that you're trying to tackle, because they are very big concepts. And very difficult concepps as well. So they're hard. And on top of all that, you also go to mystery. Like this is also a medical mystery. So how did you balance that?
I think depending on the reviewers, they'll say I didn't balance that. But the funny thing is, Firuz is not like necessarily actively going after the mystery in some cases, like it's kind of unfolding around them and they're keeping an eye on it, but they're just stretched so thin that they can't, it's not like they can be like, all right, well, I'm going to ignore the fact that I've got 2 siblings I've got to take care of and an ailing mother who's never around. And I've got this job that I'm working constantly at the clinic. By the way, I haven't been home in 3 days. I haven't eaten in 2 days. So let me also go after
and play the tension.
I think that's the one way I could balance it was that Firuz was like, I'm going to let that unfold until I can no longer ignore it. Because that happens, right? Like there's so many times where we're stretched so thin in our lives that we can see something needs attention and we're like, oh man, I just cannot pay attention to that thing until all of a sudden it's a fire. And then you're like, crap, now I can't not pay attention to that thing. That happens, and it can be something that you're like, it's not always, oh, hey, this body seems like it's kind of still alive when it's supposed to be dead. That's not usually the case.
It's a horrifying thing.
But there's so many, we are so busy in our lives. Our attentions are stretched so many different ways. I think especially with the internet, it makes it so easy to have our attention spread in 5 different places. So that we don't know that it's place number 3 that's really setting an alarm bell until it's too late. Again, usually not in like an unmixed plane, but
but we're all juggling glass balls and like you gotta make sure that you're juggling balls that you can manage.
Right. And if a few slip and break, you're like, well, I can try to attend to it, I can try to sweep it up, but like something else is gonna fall if I pay too much attention to that. And that's that's a reality I think we all definitely at some point hit that during the pandemic, or even if we're not healthcare workers, right? Even if we're not caregivers or we don't have public-facing jobs, I think we all just got to a point where we're like, God, I'm so exhausted. Like I'm so exhausted staring at a screen and Zoom. I'm so exhausted not being able to see my friends and family, of like having to go to the grocery store and be afraid that I'm going to get sick just because I need to go pick up my groceries. And then if you've gotten COVID, it sucks. It sucks so much. And like I lost an entire month and I was double vaccinated and boosted, right? And like and people are dying, and like it's just you don't have to be doing extraordinary things, just feel exhausted all the time.
Sometimes surviving is in itself the most that you can do.
Exactly.
Like given everything that's going on in your book with the plague and also the mystery behind the plague too, and like do you feel safe on the streets, and like your main character is also worried about prejudices of other people and hiding certain elements of themselves, their magic, because that others them in this community. It's a lot to juggle, it's a lot to worry about.
And I think if you are multi-marginalized, like that's a reality, right? Like there's many of us, like I have a lot of passing privilege, right? Like a lot of times I pass as cis and straight. I have light skin, so like if I'm not, if I'm wearing a mask, it's easy to kind of not pay attention to me as opposed to somebody who has darker skin or who who's queer and their partner resembles whatever queerness looks like, right? That you get targeted, right? And so like anything that you can do to protect yourself, you kind of take advantage of. Of course, there's like the other side of the violence, which is invisibility, right? Like I hate being invisible, and yet it's such a privilege to be so protected by it. And that's like, and because I have that privilege, that means I'm not going to be targeted 10 times out of 10, right? So yeah, it's just exhausting. So yeah, this book, this book is definitely a reflection of being like a queer trans person of color. Because Fuse is a queer trans person of color, although granted everyone in this book is a person of color, there's no whiteness, but you know, they're coming from an ethnic group that was once an empire and is now being marginalized, and it's in the midst of a refugee crisis. So your migration status also impacts how you're receiving care, how you're interacting with, you know, others, you know, kind of on top of everything else. So yeah, they have it rough. They have it really rough, and it's funny because part of why I did that was to make them not paying attention to their younger brother feel a little more sympathetic, because I thought that was one of the most egregious things that I could do in the book. But now looking back, I'm like, no, I would really put them through the ringer. I'm really bad for them. Like, sorry, dudes. Sorry, buddy.
I don't want to say how it worked out in the end.
Yeah.
You gotta read the book to find out.
Yeah, it's a hopeful ending, I hope. You know, like,
Yeah.
you know, despite all the bleakness that is in here, I really wanted it to be hopeful, because grimdark is exhausting. We live in a grimdark world,
Yeah.
right? Like, you know, it feels like every day you're gonna flip on the news and something else happens. And you're like, oh, God dang it. Like I told you earlier, we live in the worst dystopia, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is the worst timeline.
We live in the worst timeline.
Yeah, so I did want there at the very end to at least feel like there's a flicker of hope.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think, you know, given the subjects that your book tackles, but also just like SFF in general, I think, you know, there can be a lot of violence and just a lot.
Yeah.
In SFF novels, especially because, like you were saying, they often cover like empires, and you know, a lot of them have wars.
Yeah,
and, you know, there
a
are
lot of
these
wars.
lots of wars, which are, you know, can be fascinating to read about because they say a lot about human nature and, you know, about the world. But, you know, being able to like read a character story and being able to drill down into something that feels more human and more relatable, and, you know, Favors' like ability to juggle everything, and sometimes
Or
not.
inability.
Yeah, I was gonna say sometimes not juggle. That was all extremely relatable. I mean, like, as you know, I also like to write characters who, you know, even though they're on this like epic journey for this,
Such
like,
disasters.
they're such disasters.
Like babies.
And you know, they all have these epic titles. You know, you have like the Midnight Merchant who
Yeah.
sells these relics and it's legendary, and you have her Jin bodyguard who is, you know, extremely competent.
Yeah.
And
To
you have-
say the least. I love him. So grumpy.
he's dealing with a bunch of disasters
Yeah.
on this trip. But yeah, you have like characters who, you know, by all appearances are perceived to be competent. Maybe not Mazin.
Maybe not Mazin,
Mazin
yeah.
in the
Sweet
copy is
boy.
called A Cowardly Prince, and he is very much a coward. He's trying his best.
Fools are scary. I don't blame him.
He was very much the relatable character.
Yeah.
At least for me, he was. You know, he was the character who was scared of everything and kind of, you know, in awe of.
Sweet boy.
Yeah, he's along for the ride. Thinks it's going to be a good ride
Oh,
until
no.
but yeah, no, you know, the idea of characters who are disasters, who mess up a lot, who
Yeah.
are like, you know, a lot of responsibility is put on them because they have, you know, people assume they have all this power.
Yeah.
Fairuz is a healer, and so will depend on Fairuz, and you know, that stress gets to them a lot,
Yeah.
understandably, because you know there's so many bodies coming in because of the planning. There's so much happening. But to see those characters struggle in human ways, and I think to see them mess up, even with the big stakes,
Yeah.
you know, that like, as a reader, I mean, and as a writer, I guess, I always love following characters like that, because it feels, one, they're characters who I feel like I root for because I relate to them more. But also too, I'm like, I understand this. Like, even though this is a big fantasy world and you know, all these terminologies are being thrown around, and this is literally a secondary world. This is not my world. I still feel that there are echoes in this world that can root us in place.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's again one of the many things that I love about your book is your idea that is your ability to make it into this very personal story as well. I have to ask about your side characters.
Yeah.
And
please do.
yeah, and how you. First of all, I have to ask if you have a favorite side character. You have a really wonderful found family in the story that I adore. And then second, how did you go about crafting their stories, you know, with everything else that was going on in the plot?
That's a good question. Do I have, oh man, I really love all of, you know, there's not a ton of characters in this because it's 40,000 words. And I have a special place in my heart for each of them, which is not a good answer because, you know, my instinct answer is Malika, who we get very little of because she's just very sassy. She reminds me a lot of Aisha, actually. Like, I think they would be on the same wavelength. I just really like very competent, sassy women who are like, I cannot put up with this shit. Like, I really love that character. So I really enjoy Malika. And I liked giving Phoebe's a friend. You know, like I feel like I love friendship stories. You know, and so many of us like, you know, we as a culture we tend to emphasize romance, but that's like, you know, I talk to any queer person who'll be like, oh, but our friends were there for us first, right? Like, you know, any kid who's ever been lonely and found like a friend to anchor them, right? Like that's something that a lot of us are really like, no, this was the thing that was so important to me. Friend breakups are, I don't want to say they're kind of more devastating than romantic breakups in many respects, right? Because you have a different set of expectations and a different level, a different kind of trust anyway. So I really wanted to give Phoebe like a friend, you know, I think
deserve
yeah,
one.
I love stories of friends and certainly like reading YA, I get that, but I sometimes I look around and I'm like, do I have like some of my favorite books, like, are there really good friendships in there? You know, we've got like the romantic stakes, we've got the political stakes, but I wonder how many like friends we get. So I really wanted that. But, you know, like I also, you know, siblings are my bread and butter. Like all of my stories have a sibling story at their core. So I love Pyrees. I love that I could give, he's not the comic relief, but he like, you know, there's this funny joke in the book about him hating eggplants. And I just really needed there to be some sort of levity in a book that's so hard. And like what 15-year-old isn't going to have like a least favorite food or like have something that they're like, oh my God, get that away from me. That's so gross. And for Pyrees, it's eggplant, you know, and he's just like, so I like giving that to him. And I also, like, I also put him through the ringer because his plot is about wanting to medically transition. And he's like, Firuz, you are literally the only person who can help me because otherwise I have to go do surgery and that's expensive. We don't have the money for that. But you have blood magic. So
and another thing to Firuz.
Yeah, right, exactly. And Firuz, you know, having also gone through a top surgery like procedure, understands what it's like to have gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia. And it feels totally helpless, right? So I wanted to give things to Pyrees to hold on to, you know, so he wants to be a tailor and he hates eggplants and he's a good boy. He's a good boy. He's a sweet boy, and Fido's is a complete pushover. You know, they're about 15 years apart, so they have a sibling relationship, but also a caregiver like child-y relationship. And Fido's, you know, like lives and breathes and dies by Pyrees, like would do anything, and it feels so helpless to help him. But then, you know, like Asuna is you know, that's like one of the found family elements, and if I write a sequel, it'll be about her because she's such a pain. Yeah, she really is. Her. She's such a firebrand, and I love giving Firuz this like, oh great, now I have another responsibility. If you can tell, all of this is about Firuz's responsibilities to the world. But I like writing, you know, I really like the traumatized orphan meets the grumpy caregiver trope. That's one of my favorite tropes. Like the fact that we got The Witcher and The Mandalorian coming out in like the same year, I was like, oh, I live for like the powerful orphan and the grumpy caregiver. Yes. Yeah, no, I love it so much. And so I would like, you know, that was kind of always their relationship. Asuna was in like the early drafts from the beginning. Actually, originally Kofi had adopted her, and I was like, this doesn't actually make because he has the means, and I was like, this doesn't actually make sense in terms of like the ethnic background, right? Like, why would she decide that she would go with this rando as opposed to this other rando who at least had her culture? So, you know, so from the get-go, we have this person who's like, I'm not good at this caregiving stuff, and all of a sudden, got this 14-year-old who is just like too much for me. Like, I you know, the equivalent of she has too much energy, except she has too much magic. And you know, so like, and she's deeply traumatized, right? She has a very, very rough backstory, and has, you know, by the end of the book undergoes more trauma. And Firuz also has undergone a lot of trauma, and so they're butting heads because they're like a teacher-student relationship, but they're also butting heads because here are two very traumatized people trying to connect.
Yeah.
And I wanted there to be a space for a young girl to be able to be angry and to be messy and to not have her shit together, because she's 14.
Yeah.
She's 14 and she's undergone so much trauma. So she, also special place in my heart. And then of course Kofi, who's our, the last character we really see, or we have a couple of other very, very side characters, but I wanted Firuz to have someone that they could depend on. And Kofi from the get-go, is open and available there for Firuz. Originally, Firuz, in the very first draft, Firuz was working outside of a merchant's tent because they had magic, and Kofi comes up to them and they go, "You're a healer. I don't know what you're doing over here. Let me coach you. Come work at my clinic." And Firuz is like, "Okay." I really wanted Firuz to have someone that, because they've undergone a lot of trauma, they're not quick to trust, but very slowly is trying to open up to this person who's like, "I will take care of you the best of my ability. I need your help because I'm running this clinic and I'm fighting the political forces that are trying to shut down this clinic. But I will do what I can to make sure that you and yours are taken care of." So he's a good guy despite directions of things.
I love that they have a backstory behind the backstory.
Yeah, there's a lot that didn't go in here that if it was a novel,
and it's changed so much because Fairness is the one who seeks out. And so that's so interesting that the dynamic changed around. But also I feel like that in itself is a progression story of how their characters progressed over time.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating. As someone who writes so many words that get cut and writes so many additional backstories that never make it into the book. I feel that. And I'm just super fascinated by those, everything that doesn't make it into the book, but which is, a part of the book.
Yeah,
anyways.
absolutely. And I think, I was talking with an author friend of mine, and he was like, "So, what's Kofi's deal? Are you going to write more about Kofi?" And I'm like, "I think Kofi deserves to have a short story because there is he does have quite a backstory, and his relationship with his partner, which is only mentioned a few times because it's 40,000 words, drives a lot of what he does. And we don't get to see that because it's just from Firuz's perspective. And Firuz, basically they just keep their head down, keep going. That's kind of their this is how I survive, I keep my head down. And maybe if they looked up, things would be a little different, right? Things could have changed. So I think I need to write a short story to at least release it on my email list host or something and be like, "Here."
Well, the way I see it, you've sprinkled backstory throughout throughout your novella as a little treat, but also potentially as a foreshadow of things to come. We're all hopeful.
I hope.
I just spoke the crowd. You were saying earlier that you know a lot about this world, and you were only able to give us 40,000 words in this world. But do you have any ideas that you're going to come back to? You said that you were going to play with some short stories, but are there any specific things that you're working on right now in the world, or of course anything else that you want to share as well?
So the novel, which will hopefully be in my lovely agency box at the end of next week, has been draft. I mean, I'm not even kidding. This is at least draft 15 of this damn book. It's the one that actually started this world. It takes place 40 years after the events of Qilwa, on Firuz's home country of Dalmun, in an island off the coast of Dalmun, but still part of the country, where there's a magical monastery. So it's a dark academia, and it follows three protagonists, one of whom is a Sasanian who lived in a settlement that fled after the genocide. One of whom is the heir to the noble house who blamed for the genocide. And then their little anxious being friend who helps kind of gel things together. Yeah, he's the best. I mean, everyone who reads this book is like, "Raoul, I will die for it." I mean,
excited.
Yeah, he's an anxious being and he's very grumpy. So so that has, again, it's like 15 goddamn drafts or something. But that is also, I definitely love it. It's a chunky book, but it's a quiet story. It's about their interpersonal relationships, their traumas. And ultimately, it's two of the narrators helping the third come to terms with the violent death of their brother. That's really kind of the heart of the story, but then there's a lot of political stuff that kind of keeps getting in the way. And they're like, okay, do we try to solve the mystery of like what happened in the genocide? What happened 40 years ago? For some reason, 40 tends to be a number for me because it comes up in this book too, that like things happen 40-year chunks. I don't know why. It's like,
become a part of your author brand.
yeah, I guess just like 40 years and then 40 other years there. So that, that hopefully will be out to editors soon. And that's kind of really exploring the aftermath. But it's actually the first book in a duology standalone. The second book is the prequel that explains what happens at the genocide and what happened. There's a very brief mention of a giant bird monster in the sky in here. So it's the story of the giant bird monster and the genocide. And like, that one is definitely like on a more epic fantasy scale. So the narrators of that is the person who's blamed for the genocide. Spoiler, and the queen. So yeah, that is definitely on kind of the more traditional epic fantasy scale. But there's so many things that are not answered in the first novel that I needed to have a follow-up that's like, here's the answers that, as a reader, I would want to have. As a writer, I'm very excited to write. Let's hope I have the writing chops to pull that one off because it's gonna be easy.
I have no doubt. No, and of course, we're all very excited to see what happens next in this world because, like I said, I feel like you throw in these little teasers. I'm like, I would love to see everyone's backstory. I would simply read a novella about all of them. But Feiruz was, such a wonderful main character and loved following someone who was, not the typical go-getter hero in a fantasy novel, I think. I mean, Feiruz, does a lot of good, but like you said, in this more quiet way. I mean, they're a healer. And I'm thinking about the pandemic and how, health professionals were going through all this stuff. And a lot of people weren't really thinking about that. They just kind of took that healthcare for granted. And so I think, placing Feiruz as not a hero because they're not a hero, but like, centering the story on them, and, giving them a voice and, allowing us to see some of the behind the scenes of maybe what that would have looked like. What that looks like for sure in this world, but also like, which maybe has echoes in our world. I thought it was all extremely fascinating and I loved entering the world through their perspective. In some ways, Feiruz is, I don't want to call them a passive protagonist, but in some ways they are, things are happening around them. They're living life.
And they're reacting to it because that's what happens, like the way that we as humans, kind of everyday folk have agency is very different than the way that like a monarch has agency, that is so different. So often we have to just react to the things that are happening to us, or we have to act based on the information that's given to us, no matter how limited or flawed that information is. And that's what Feiruz is as a protagonist. That's why like they don't go after the mystery because they don't have time. They have to just react as the mystery is unspooling around them. Or like, the government in Qilwa is restricting medical access for the migrants. And they don't have the time to just like go and bang on the governor's door and fight. That's what Kofi does. So much of what Kofi is doing is like, all right, well, I'm gonna go fight the governor. You hold down the fort here. And so Feiruz is like, all right, I gotta hold down the fort. Like I gotta treat the people who are coming in with sniffles at the same time that people are coming with the plague. Which is exactly what happened in health, for healthcare in our world, right? Like hospital beds were being filled with people with COVID, and yet the people who had cancer or who did surgery or still getting sick still needed access. And oh, by the way, the beds are all full. And so, okay, I'm a doctor. What do? I got to try to shuffle things around and hope that I can help as many people as I can. By the way, I still have my own responsibilities with family and loved ones to take care of.
I'm still a human.
So so I think in many ways, Feiruz is not it's not a go-getter protagonist, it's not the hero because they're just like us. And not everyone, a lot of people want to read escapist stuff where they are reading about the kings and queens or people who have the ability to enact change. And I totally get that and I totally respect that. But I wanted to write a book where it's just like, no, they're just as screwed as the rest of us.
And I think it's refreshing to see, I think, in the SFF sphere because, I I too like reading stories about, kings and queens and, people in power who are good people in power, hopefully, who can enact change. And, that can be gratifying reading. But, at the same time, like you said, life happens. And sometimes, you just kind of roll with the punches and, you do what you can in reaction to situations, and you don't necessarily have the power or the ability or not in the space to be able to to control what happens, to control the outcome. And so things become reactionary rather than rather than directly manipulating the plot, which I think a lot of people have come to expect from a lot of especially like in the SFF sphere again. You have these heroes who are like very competent heroes, and people who are extremely brave and will go on these epic journeys or solve these really intense mysteries, and they won't stop until they get the answer. We're all human. So are the characters, fictional humans, but they've got their own responsibilities to deal with.
But the characters I think a lot of us relate to or find really compelling are the ones that are very human and like very not just flawed because they're flawed, but also because they're like making decisions that are like, oh honey, oh no. And I think the Stardust Thief does this really well. Like despite there being a prince, like God, he has no power to do anything. Like nobody listens to him, nobody takes him seriously. No. He's just this, and he does brave things because he's like, shit, I have no choice. Like I have, and then it's just like panicking about it after the thing is done and like freaking out about it, right? Like
literally running away from things, trembling as he does.
Yeah, just like poor baby, and like arguably, our beloved gym bodyguard is probably the one with the most power, and he doesn't make great choices either. He does a lot of withholding, and like it damages his relationship with Lily in a kind of major way. And Aisha's perfect, so it's fine.
Aisha is vengeance incarnate. And is so vicious all the way through the story. She's got her moments. Yeah. She's got her soft moments, but it makes me very happy to hear you say that about her. We love disaster characters who are trying their best. So I don't know what time we're at currently, but I was gonna say maybe time for one more question.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about video games because we are both gamers. So I'm curious about, just general influence, video games on your work, and also if you have any favorite video games.
Best question. So Dragon Age 2, definitely, like if you're a fan of Dragon Age 2, this is Dragon Age 2, the book, but like browner and queerer, to be fair. Like it's a queer normative world, so go figure. But Dragon Age 2. So Dragon Age 2 is my second favorite video game, which loses to Persona 5 Royal, which is I love this game so much. I have my problems with it, but otherwise it's a perfect game. Don't ignore my problems with it. I love it because it speaks to me as it's a great like upper YA game, and I love my YA, but it's exactly what I want in terms of like it's a band of misfits, very found family. I swear to God, they're all queer. I will die on this hill. It's also super long. Like I love games that are long.
It's like 100+ hours.
Oh, it's Royal. I think I played 139 hours to Royal, and I played 4 times. So, so good. And and I love JRPGs and like the anime style, like totally, and the whole like we're about justice and we're gonna take justice into our own hands, which isn't gonna look like the law. I'm like, yes! So I love it. I also am a big fan of Toby Fox's work. Undertale is
so good.
Deltarune is incredible. Undertale is incredible. Papyrus's theme is my ringtone, and it has been for 3 years. I was shocked. I played Undertale. I went in kind of without expectations, and just blew me away. Like it's just a thoughtful game, really thoughtful storytelling,
and it's so meta.
It's very meta.
It does such incredible. It has like such incredible mechanics. Like the game is very aware of itself.
Yeah, it's super self-aware. Yeah. And Deltarune being self-aware and also being self-aware of Undertale and being self-referential in that way is really good. And the thing I love about Undertale is that it really queers the genre in so many different ways. So it's a combination of like, I don't want to call it a walking sim, but there's bullet hell elements, there's like kind of RPG elements, but then, you know, you can, I didn't know other game does this until Deltarune, which is made by the same person, where when you're fighting the monsters, you can choose not to fight them, right? You can have a conversation with them. You can flirt with some of them, you know, like there's one where it's a dog and you pet the dog and the dog just gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it shoots up into the cloud and then you won, right? So you can show mercy. It's called showing mercy, right? When you engage with them, So like when you engage with them and then choose not to fight and kill them and instead,
and that's how you get the good ending,
right?
too,
Like you
mercy.
get a different story route as a result. So it's such a really thoughtful way of being like, you know, you can choose to go the violent route. There's 3 routes, right? There's the pacifist route, there's the neutral route, and there's the genocidal route. And the genocidal route is, as it sounds, you have to kill every single
It
enemy.
makes you feel really bad for fighting things in video games. So
Right.
like, I'm rethinking now.
and the story changes as a result, and it has a permanent impact on your future save files, unless you completely delete those save files.
The game remembers.
Yeah, the game remembers, and it's really just, it's very, very meta, but it's also such an interesting commentary on the way that we engage with these spaces.
Yeah.
Because like, man, do I love me shooting some zombies? Like, I love Resident Evil. You know, I like Resident Evil 4 is like, oh, the dialogue in Resident Evil 4 is so good, it's so bad, it's so good. You know, like I find it so like, who doesn't love like hacking and slashing monsters or like whatever? I'm playing The Witcher 3 right now, so I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna be competent with the swords. It's gonna be great. But then to kind of pause and be like, let me challenge that.
Yeah.
What does it look like to instead engage in a different way? It really just makes you stop and think, oh, fuck, like how do I engage kind of in my everyday with things that I'm supposed to be confrontational with? And sometimes the answer is like, yeah, confront white supremacy. You know, like, yeah, confront homophobia. Yes, absolutely fight those things. But sometimes the answer is like, how do I relate to this human who I'm interacting with, and we're not coming from the same page maybe? How can we then try to shift the script and try to come to the level? So I will buy everything Toby Fox ever puts out. He's such a weirdo too. He's so weird, and I love him for it. But he's a creative genius, and he's, you know, like amazing for it. But
There's so many incredible stories being told in video games right now.
I want people, you know, like people who don't take games seriously as a storytelling medium, take it seriously as a storytelling medium. Not just, I mean, so like there are the AAA games, there are the Personas, right?
Yeah.
There are the Dragon Ages, but then the indie studios that are just they're making different choices.
Such thoughtful games.
They're making really thoughtful games. There are games that will, you know, like gamify the game. Like, what does it mean to engage it as a game? You know, like, are you enjoying this? Sometimes games are not about enjoying it, and that's telling a different kind of story, right?
Dark
Like,
Souls.
oh my god, my husband plays Dark Souls. My wife, I'm like, this is so painful. Oh my god. You know, but like I played a little bit of the Cat Lady, which came out I think in 2011, and it's about this woman with depression, and I could only play it for maybe a couple hours because I was like, God, I have major depression, and I was like, I don't want to deal with this. But it's such a, especially if you don't have depression, I can imagine that game being like, oh, holy shit, is this what it's like? And like, yeah, when it gets bad, this is exactly what it's like. It's just, it's dark. Your movements are very slow. You have very limited kind of slow dialogue choices. There's weird imagery. And so that, you know, the indie studios are the ones that are really kind of pushing the bounds with that. So I recommend that. There's a book called The Queer Games Avant-Garde. It's edited by Bo Ruberg, who is a professor at UC Irvine. And they interviewed a bunch, I think it's 20 or 26 queer creators of video games, to ask them, like, what does it mean to create like queer avant-garde games? Because these are games that like there's one it's called like the kissing game or something, where you and the other player have to consent. That's like the first step. And then you're just controlling these giant flopping tongues. And you're like, you can lick the eyeball. You know, it's just like a very, you know, there's no points to like per se. You're just like, you know, so it's kind of like partially about the nature of consent, partially about like how weird bodies are. You know, like, bodies are weird. Bodies are super weird. And if you're ever in like a sexual relationship with someone, like at some point, like, God, this is a weird thing that we're doing. Like when you stop and think about it, it's like, you know, like, wait a minute, like, and you know, like, so a lot of these games are just kind of this really strange game, but it's a really interesting look into like queer games creators and the kinds of things that they're doing. Even if it's a game that I'm like, I don't think I ever want to play that. Like, you know, but it's so interesting to see like, here's how we're challenging what this form can look like and what the stories are that we can tell in this form. So
right, I mean, because it's visual, but then you also have video games. I mean, there's some that are more dialogue heavy, there's some that are script heavy, and I feel like there's so many different formats
Yeah.
across video games, which means that there's more to, that will appeal to different people. But then you do have creators who are using the forms in very thoughtful ways. And I mean, I always love talking to people about, being inspired by video games, how that translates into books. Because I think very often people think of them as two separate things. But if you can be inspired by a TV show, if you can be inspired by a movie, then why not the storytelling that video games provide as well?
I absolutely agree. And every writer who I know who's also a gamer or vice versa is like, yes. So
And like I was gonna say, for me, Tales of
tell me.
so Tales of series, I think was monumental for me. That video game does this thing where there are skits throughout the video game. So this is a mechanic in the game. So there are cutscenes, where the characters are speaking to each other within the storyline. But then you'll just be wandering the world map, and say you interact with, I don't know, an apple or something. And then a skip button will appear. If you click the skip, it's just the characters' portraits. They're animated and they're talking to each other on the screen about this apple. Totally random thing, not at all related to the story, but it builds character.
That's really interesting.
And it's used to like to embellish the world as well. So the characters will be, say they'll be wandering around a city, and then you'll sleep at the inn one day, and then that will prompt a conversation about this inn being new to the city. And so the characters will say, some character will say, 5 years ago I came to the city and this inn was not here. And so it will like give you all of these insights into the world that you would not get from the normal storyline. And I think for me, I really love character banter.
Dragon Age is good for that too. Dragon Age is a lot of characters.
Clearly I need to play more Dragon Age. But yeah, no, so like I feel like video game banter especially has been really influential for me. And some games definitely do it better than others. But that's the case with books too. That's the case with any creative medium. But growing up, I played a lot of video games, and I played a lot of JRPGs and RPGs, and so they were very heavy on that dialogue. And that's very, I was talking to a friend about this the other day. It's really interesting when you think about video game pacing versus, novel pacing. Because in a novel, I think people expect, there's this expectation that when the characters are speaking to each other, even if it's a seemingly random conversation, it's going to contribute in some way to the character or to the world. Like it has to be necessary to the story. Whereas in video games, there's not necessarily that expectation. It's, here's a little anecdote, and it does something for the player, like it's a fun little mechanic. But this talk about the apple may not, it will enrich the experience of playing the game, but it might not like contribute anything to the plot. So I think about that a lot when I write, because I played all these games and I listened to all this banter, and I love banter so much, and I think series like the Tales of series do it so well, because they have like the big overarching plot things that are happening, but then the characters also have this space to just rant about things and to like talk about this random thing that they saw the other day, and it says something about their personalities. And when I was writing the Stardust Thief, and I think in everything that I write, we have like the direct, or I want to say more direct influences, like the Bag of Infinite Space, which I've had a lot of gaming people say like, hey, that seems like endless inventory. I'm like, yes, it is amazing. I'm so glad you saw this. But I think my dialogue, I think like the way the characters speak to each other, I think especially for this being like an adventure story, a journey story, there are those moments of downtime where the characters are just sitting around a fire and they're just bantering back and forth. And they're bantering back and forth about things that are important to the plot, because this is a 480-page book, and it needs to keep moving. So I have to use my words wisely. But I think a lot of that inspiration does come from JRPGs. I'm also a big fan of the Persona series. I think Persona 5 is phenomenal. I think the messy group dynamic is something that Persona does really well, and all the characters are very flawed but very human. And I also really like the Final Fantasy games, which I know a lot of people really like the Final Fantasy games, but I think Final Fantasy for me, like when I think about getting into SFF, there were definitely stories that I read as a kid that, inspired me. But I think my first deep dive and appreciation of adult, or just SFF in general, was video games. Like thinking about the massive world building that was happening, and diving into a brand new world, meeting all of these characters. There's so many side characters in video games. The world is so massive. And for me, I think Final Fantasy was probably my first-ish series that really did that really like opened the world of fantasy for me.
What's your favorite Final Fantasy?
That's a hard question.
You tell me your top 3. I
I want to say Final Fantasy VII, but the original. I do like the remake, but I appreciate that the original is one game.
Yeah, that's true.
And not like, however many it's gonna be 7 or something probably. So I really like 7. I remember really liking 10. 10 has a special place in my heart just because it was one of the first ones that I played.
10 is so good.
Yeah. And it has, I think the way it does, the world building in that game is really interesting.
Yeah.
And it's also a journey story. It's about, this character who is going off to save the world, and has this sort of like ragtag team around her. So there's elements of found family in it too.
I love 10. 10
Yeah.
is,
10 is really great. I don't know about a third one. I want to say 6, Final Fantasy 6. And that one was, I like how you played all these games.
I watched my husband play 6, but I have a special place in my heart for 6. The soundtrack is really good.
The soundtrack is really good.
They're all the soundtracks are really good, but 6 is.
Yeah. 6 is, I also think like just really, I don't know, like the cast is very interesting in 6. But it kind of reminds me a little bit of, have you ever played Chrono Trigger?
Oh, have I played Chrono Trigger?
You just sit up here gushing about 20 minutes.
Oh, that game holds up too. That game is a masterpiece of both
say.
storytelling and gameplay. Like,
I was gonna say 6 kind of has
Chrono Trigger vibe. I agree.
But yeah, so I love that we're both influenced by video games. And I love that you can see those influences scattered throughout the stories.
Stardust Thief would be such a good video game. It's definitely in there, and I could see it done so well as an RPG. So, and you could rotate through the characters depending on the part of the game, or it would be great. So.
Manifest.
Yeah.
It's a faraway dream, but maybe someday in the future. And I hope you also get your Dragon Age-esque adaptation too.
I think, would this be a walking sim? Like, I don't know. It would be a different kind of game there. It wouldn't be like a traditional. I don't think it would be this specifically. I don't think it would be an RPG. It would be something else. But
it's a good world exploration game. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that is a good wrap-up point.
Yeah.
But it was so much fun doing this with you. Yeah, of course. And if you have not bought Naseem's book, then what are you waiting for?
Yeah.
If you want a big chunky fantasy
It's quick
book.
read though. It's pacing is quick. So yeah.
Thank you. I like to think so. But yeah, thank you so much, Naseem.
Yeah, thank you, Chelsea, and thank you to the Bureau of General Services Queer Division for hosting us and having this conversation. Thanks y'all for tuning in at home. Order our books from these guys if you can, so that you can support local indies. So especially doing the big queer work. So
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. And yes, both titles are on our online store and in our physical store. So thanks everyone who joined us online. Have a good night.